Mhm. Okay, well, welcome everybody. We're just going to wait a minute or two for more folks to trickle in here, and then we'll get started.
You'll hear us say this a couple of times, but we don't have the chat open. We have the Q&A box going. If you have questions during the presentation, please ask it through the Q&A feature, and we will do our best to accommodate as many of these questions as possible.
All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. So, first of all, I still see some more folks are trickling in, but we'll start off with some quick introductions. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. My name is David Barboza. I'm a senior housing policy specialist with HCD's ADU team. And I'm joined here by my colleague, Mike Van Gorder, also a senior housing policy specialist. And we'll be your presenters today. Um, so today's webinar is about the 2026 ADU Handbook Addendum. And maybe we'll wait just a little bit more for a few more folks to trickle in. Like Mike mentioned earlier, we do have a Q&A feature available here through Zoom. So if you have questions as we go through the presentation, please leave them there as opposed to the chat box. And we'll get to as many questions as we can before we end at 2:30. Okay, I see we're over about 500 participants here. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. Um, first, before we get into the details of the handbook addendum, we'd like to lay some groundwork. We'll just talk about ADUs in general, some key terms that'll be helpful as we go through, and just the significance of ADUs in California housing policy. So first off, we'll lay some groundwork with some definitions. So an accessory dwelling unit, or an ADU, is defined in the statute as a dwelling unit on a property with an existing or proposed primary residence that's going to include permanent provisions or spaces for living, sleeping, eating, cooking, and sanitation. And then there are various variations that are possible. So you can have an ADU that's attached to another structure. It can be detached, can be converted, it can take the form of an efficiency unit, like a unit that doesn't have its own separate bedroom. and it can take the form of a manufactured home. And then we have a related concept, a junior accessory dwelling unit, or JADU. So these are going to be limited to 500 square feet of interior livable space. They're contained within a single family residence, and that can include an attached garage. A JADU can share a bathroom with the main house, or it can have its own bathroom. So like in this example on the right, you can see there's a site plan with an existing house, an existing detached garage, and the JADU is formed by converting a portion of the house into that. Okay, and then a couple of terms here to keep in mind. So particularly the first one, livable space. As you'll see, changes to ADU law that were signed last year made this concept more prevalent in the law. So livable space is a space in a dwelling intended for human habitation, including living, sleeping, eating, cooking, or sanitation. So it's like slightly different from the concept of habitable space in the Building Standards Code. Living, sleeping, eating, cooking, and sanitation are part of livable space. And then there's living area, which is the interior habitable area of a dwelling unit, including basements and attics, but not including a garage or any accessory structure. Okay, and then another pair of terms that are important here are local agency and permitting agency. We'll get into this more as we talk about review procedures. So a local agency is just a city or county. And by contrast, a permitting agency is any entity that's involved in the review of an ADU permit. So any like discrete entity. So for example, a planning department, building department, a utility, a special district, these are all permitting agencies. So the idea is like within a local agency, you have various permitting agencies. A couple other concepts to keep in mind here are non-conforming zoning conditions. So these are physical improvements on a property that do not conform to current zoning standards. And then objective standards, very, very important concept in ADU law because ADU applications have to be reviewed ministerially, meaning only based on objective standards. So these are standards that involve no personal or subjective judgment by a public official and are uniformly verifiable by reference to external criteria that everybody can know in advance. Okay, in advance of an application being submitted, that is. So this is a concept, particularly when we're reviewing ordinances, we're looking out to make sure that the standards that we're seeing are objective. Okay, and then the next concept here, this is getting at like the different categories of ADUs in state ADU law and how they're regulated differently. So 66323 units are just ADUs that are described by Government Code Section 66323. Sometimes they're called statewide exemption ADUs. So the key thing about these units is that they're only subject to the development standards that are listed in Government Code Section 66323. That makes them different from other ADUs, which are subject to a broader set of standards that are defined by the law. So they have to be approved notwithstanding those other standards in the ADU ordinance. What's going to be applicable to 66323 units are standards in the Building Standards Code, except for manufactured homes, which have their own federal building standards. And those standards, again, that are specifically listed or referenced in Government Code Section 66323. So these are things like side and rear setback requirements for detached ADUs and height limits. And this is a diagram that's just meant to illustrate kind of like the concept of how these ADU categories are different. So the first section of state ADU law starts talking about ADU ordinances and how ADUs can be configured and what development standards can apply to them is Government Code Section 66314. So that section describes actually kind of the full range, right? Attached, detached, and conversion ADUs. But then Government Code Section 66323 carves out these specific ADU types. So single family conversion ADU, a JADU, uh, single-family detached ADU not exceeding 800 square feet, multifamily conversion ADUs, multifamily detached ADUs. So it's so that's kind of the difference. So when you like go through that list under 66323, what you find left over is things like attached new construction ADUs, single family detached ADUs over 800 square feet. So this is just meant to clarify the difference. And the key thing to keep in mind is that these two categories of ADUs are regulated very differently. Okay, and so just for some background and context, we wanted to share with you statistics about ADU permitting in California over the past decade or so. So what you see looking at the chart here is that obviously ADU permits have ticked up significantly, and really the big change happened starting in 2017. There was a few bills that made ADU law significantly stronger. And then it's been refined since then. So now we're at a point, in 2024 when over 30,000 ADUs were permitted across the state. And that's actually 26% of new housing units permitted statewide. So this policy area is a significant part of the way that California is trying to grapple with its affordability challenges. And then I think it's always really important to keep in mind like why we care about ADUs in the first place and like the policy goals that they're related to achieving. And so they really have a lot of benefits. The first is in the category of affordability. ADUs are often built on properties that have already been paid for or in the process of being paid for. They don't necessarily involve like new land acquisition. And so that's a big factor in making them affordable. By definition, they tend to be smaller homes, and so that's helpful for affordability, as is just the fact that they're being built with wood frame construction. ADUs are can be an important source of income for homeowners, contractors, and local governments. So they're really an economic development tool. They're a financial flexibility tool for homeowners, particularly with changing life circumstances. And they're a great strategy to provide family support for extended families, senior citizens, adult children, just all these, folks coming out of high school and college, trying to get a foothold in the job market, might need a little support from family there while maintaining some privacy. And then, this idea that ADUs can be a really important solution for people with disabilities as well. Not because they're necessarily required to comply with more accessibility standards, but because they're often built for specific purposes. They're often built with the needs of a specific occupant in mind. And so if somebody is, for example, been in a house that was built in the 1950s, and that house was not built with any thought to accessibility, and the person's getting older, maybe building an ADU is a way to kind of stay in the community while accommodating some new physical needs. And so also just thinking about the fact that, our society is diverse, it's complex. We're not all nuclear families. There are a lot of single people and couples, other small households that need housing solutions, right? So there's a need for more variety and choice and flexibility in our housing options. And just that idea that you can kind of have an extended family or friends or groups of people that are close, that can support each other, but still have some privacy from each other. But there's more. From a housing supply, California, as we all know, has a housing affordability challenge. It's very serious. That's rooted in a lack of supply. And so ADUs are a way to add to the supply of housing, to get to a better balance between supply and demand, but without dramatically changing the look and feel of neighborhoods. So they're kind of a stealthy way to add density and living options for folks. There are also different options in terms of tenure. So there are ways to develop ADUs that can be sold separately, either to a lower moderate income household, maybe a first-time home buyer, or as a condo unit. On the environmental sustainability front, ADUs are typically an example of infill development within existing communities. And so what that's going to do is it's going to save natural habitats, working lands like farmlands. It's going to take advantage of existing infrastructure instead of having to build new infrastructure to serve development. And by locating people close to jobs and services in existing communities, it tends to reduce driving as well. So these are important strategies to help achieve our environmental goals. Also, if you think about it in terms of, these are new units that are being built to the current version of the energy code, so they tend to be very energy efficient. And just the fact that they're modestly sized means they're tending not to use a lot of energy, particularly for HVAC. And then we can think about ADUs in terms of equity, fairness, first of all, like creating housing opportunities in neighborhoods that haven't traditionally they perhaps created so many housing opportunities, giving folks a foothold in different neighborhoods. And then equity in the sense of wealth building and home equity, giving folks a path to improve their financial situation. Okay, and so with that introductory piece out of the way, I'll pass it over to Mike to talk about some frequently asked questions that we get.
David, please mute yourself. We're having some complaints in the thread here. All right, so HC gets inquiries from all over the state constantly. We're trying to provide as much information to the public and to local jurisdictions as possible. And we hear a lot of the same questions again and again. So we thought it'd be helpful to provide a sort of overview of the greatest hits. So I'd like to talk today about by right unit combinations, maximum allowances, subjective design standards, front setback exceptions, and deed restrictions. Slide, please. Okay, so this is the one that comes up the most. By right unit combinations per 66323 subdivision A. This section states, notwithstanding sections 66314 to 66322 inclusive, a local agency shall ministerially approve an application for a building permit within a residential or mixed-use zone to create any of the following. So if we break this down into the different formats of primary dwelling, it turns into, with a single-family primary, one internal or converted ADU, one JADU, and one new construction detached up to 800 square feet. With existing multifamily primaries, you can have converted non-livable space up to 25% of the primary dwelling units, and detached ADUs, as many as existing units exist on the lot, with a maximum of 8. With the proposed multifamily primary, you can only have up to 2 detached ADUs, but these are all required to be considered ministerially by the local jurisdiction. Slide, please. Maximum allowances. So section 66314 is the local development standards subject section of state ADU law. This provides for larger units, larger detached units, and it's the only section that provides for new construction attached units. This section requires at least one unit subject to local development standards of any format. It's interior, new construction attached, new construction detached. Section 66323 requires multiple ADUs of specifically defined formats. State ADU law requires these to be combined with one another in any order. Functionally, what that means is that you might see combinations of a new construction detached 800 square feet per 66323. That would be required to be combined with, for example, another detached unit up to 1,000 square feet if it's 2 bedrooms, or 850 square feet, it's 1 bedroom or less. Slide, please. We get a lot of questions about subjective criteria. So section 66314B requires local development standards to be objective, verifiable with data and the dictionary. We have sent findings to local jurisdictions based on the following subjective terms. This is not a complete list, but compatible, consistent, neighborhood character, visibility, subordinate. Those can mean anything. It can mean different things to different people. And state ADU law says specifically you must have objective standards. So anywhere where you see these kinds of words, that would be inconsistent with state ADU law. Slide, please. Okay, front setbacks. We hear this one a lot. Section 66321B3 prohibits a lot coverage, floor area ratio, open space size relative to the primary, lot size, and front setbacks from precluding an 800 square foot unit. So Section 66323 units may not be restricted in the front setbacks in any way. And 314 units may be requested to be in the side or the rear setbacks, but if no other location exists on a lot that would allow for an 800 square foot unit, it must be allowed entirely within the front setback. Slide, please. Okay. Deed restriction. So 315 limits local development standards to what appear in 314. Deed restrictions do not appear in section 66314 and may therefore not be required with ADUs. Now, 66333, which is the JADU section, subdivision C requires a deed restriction for JADUs, but only for two specific items listed: a prohibition on separate sale of the unit and restriction on the size and attributes of the unit. We often see local jurisdictions restrict, that's where they put like term limits or other requirements. Those may not be in deed restrictions. And you can only have these two items that we've listed here. Slide, please. All right, I'll hand it back to David.
All right, thanks so much, Mike. I'll make sure everybody can hear me okay. And I see that we have a raised hand here. The way that we're planning on handling questions is if you could please drop it in the Q&A box. We'll try to get to some as we go along, and then we'll have a time for Q&A at the end. So thank you for your understanding on that. All right, so let's talk about the main subject for today, the handbook addendum. So just a little bit of historical context on the ADU handbook. The last comprehensive update we did was published in January of 2025. So the addendum is dated January 2026. And the way that this is structured, it's essentially the 2025 handbook with an addendum at the end that addresses the new laws that are taking effect in late 2025 and early 2026. So where you're going to want to look for that new content is pages 55 through 58 of the new handbook. We are planning to do another handbook update that's going to kind of weave in that new content throughout the handbook, but for now what we have is the addendum to the ADU handbook. So there are five, really six, like there's six, the sixth one is minor and we'll talk about it, but there are five major bills that were signed into law in 2025 that changed state ADU law. They had different effective dates. Three of them went into effect on January 1st. A couple of them went into effect earlier in 2025, either because they were a budget bill or an urgency statute. And so, like I mentioned, what we have here is the 2025 handbook with the addendum that addresses the new laws. So as you read through the main part of the handbook, you'll see that there are some parts that are not fully reflecting the new laws. You have to look at the addendum to get that new content. And we'll be, we're planning soon to release a more comprehensive update of the handbook that weaves all that content through. Okay, so getting into the five bills, the first is Assembly Bill 130. So I might slip into saying AB for Assembly Bill or SB for Senate Bill, so just a heads up on that. So AB 130 was a budget trailer bill. It took effect on June 30th last year. It amended Civil Code Section 714.3 and Government Code Section 66323. And so what we're going to do here is just give a quick highlight of each of the five bills, and then we're going to go through in more detail by talking about specific changes that were made in specific sections of the government code. So here we're just trying to give a very high-level overview. So what this bill did is it clarified that fees or other financial requirements in existing deed restrictions are not reasonable to apply to certain ADUs. And it further limited local regulation of 66323 units. The next bill is AB 462. This was an urgency statute, so it took effect on October 10th of 2025. It amended Government Code Section 66328 and 66329. So basically what this bill did is it created, there's a general rule in state ADU law that a primary dwelling has to have a certificate of occupancy before an ADU. But this created an exception to that rule that's related to disaster recovery. The other thing that it did is it clarified review timelines for coastal development permits for ADUs. So when you have ADU development in the coastal zone and a coastal development permit is required, now the law is more explicit about the timelines that need to be followed, regardless of whether the local agency is reviewing or the coastal commission has jurisdiction over coastal development permits. And it also limits appeals to the coastal commission under a particular section of the Coastal Act. Next, we have AB 1154. This one took effect on January 1st. It amended Government Code Section 66333. And what this did is it narrowed the owner occupancy requirement that applies to JADUs. And we'll get into the details more later. It also prohibited short-term rental of JADUs. So now it's speaking to an issue where the law was previously silent. The law previously had something to say about short-term rentals of ADUs, but not JADUs. Next up, we have SB 9, and I know not that SB 9, not the SB 9 from 2021. This is SB 9 of 2025. So this, what this does is it amends the procedures for reviewing ADU ordinances. So it puts more of a consequence on certain actions, like if the local agency, like a city or county, does not submit an ADU ordinance to HCD on time, or if we send you a letter saying, hey, we found some problems with your ordinance, you have to respond to us within a certain time. So if either of those is late, the ordinance technically becomes null and void. So it's very important to keep those deadlines in mind, and we'll get into the specifics in a bit. Next up, we have SB 543. So as you can see, this changed, this touched several different code sections in state ADU law, and it also renumbered several code sections in state ADU law. So so the big themes that run through this bill are it's creating more consistency between ADU and JADU regulations. It clarifies that when we're measuring JADU or ADU floor areas, we're talking about interior livable space. It's adding more detail and procedural requirements in terms of determining when an application is complete or not. It adds more clarity on how ADUs and JADUs can be combined with each other along the lines of what Mike was talking about. And it also provides more clarity on when school fees apply to ADUs. Okay, so now that we've given a quick overview of the 5 bills, we're going to get into we're going to dive into state ADU law, into the sections that were amended by these bills, and talk about what those specific changes are. So first, we're going to be talking about Article 1, which is general provisions. So these are parts of the law that tend to apply to both ADUs and JADUs. So first up, we have, so this is kind of like an overview of the changes that were made to Article 1 in terms of specific code sections. So the legislative intent language changed, the section on fees, the section on the special pathway to compliance for unpermitted ADUs and JADUs changed. There's a change to definitions and to the guidelines authority. All right, so the first code section that changed is Government Code Section 66311. So this is a statement of legislative intent. You'll see on some of these slides we have just like this is the primary source at the bottom. This is like what the law actually looks like. There's a way on the state legislative information website you can see the law with changes that were made by a particular bill. And so this is just highlighting those changes in blue italics. So basically, the statement of intent now includes both ADUs and JADUs. And so the idea here is that there's a general rule against arbitrary, excessive, and unreasonably burdensome requirements in ADU or JDU ordinances. And so that's a general principle to keep. The rule of reasonableness is it's not specifically defined here, but it's an important principle to keep in mind as you're writing an ADU or JDU ordinance. Okay, so next up, we have Government Code Section 66311.5. So this is the section that really gets into a lot of detail about fees that can and cannot be charged to ADUs or JDUs. So what's happening here is this is a section that actually used to be in Article 2 of the statute. So Article 2 is the article that deals with ADUs, generally deals with ADUs specifically, as opposed to JDUs. So now the section is moved and renumbered. It's in Article 1. So this reinforces the idea that, here we're talking about rules that apply to both ADUs and to JDUs. One of the main things that happens here is it clarifies that impact fee thresholds apply to interior livable space. So you can see like the quote of the statute here. ADUs have an exemption from impact fees if they have 750 square feet of interior livable space or less. So you can see the change that the bill made, where previously it just said 750 square feet. Now it's clear that we're talking about 750 square feet of interior livable space. So it's really important to be clear on that definition of livable space. And then the other thing is that it talks about school fees specifically. So school fees are like a special kind of impact fee in ADU law. They have their own code section in the education code that talks about when they can be applied. So now there's corresponding language in state ADU law that's clarifying the circumstance in which school fees can be applied to an ADU is when there's an increase in interior livable space that's greater than 500 square feet. Okay, next up. So here, this is Government Code Section 66311.7. There's a special pathway to compliance for unpermitted ADUs and JDUs that provides some more flexibility on development standards. This is another section that used to be in Article 2. So now it's in Article 1, again, to reinforce the idea that the provisions apply to both ADUs and to JDUs. The change, other than that, the change that was made is relatively minor. It's basically just updating an internal reference where in subdivision E, the law is referring to the section on fees. Okay, so the next section that changed is Government Code 66313. So this is the section that has a bunch of definitions. And here you can see in the definition of junior accessory dwelling unit, the phrase of interior livable space was added to modify 500 square feet. So you already knew an ADU, JDU was limited to 500 square feet. Now the law is clarified to indicate that we're talking about interior livable space. So that's important as you're regulating JDUs and determining whether they're over that threshold or not. Okay, so next up is Government Code Section 66313.5. So this is a section that's about guidelines authority. This is, it's basically saying that the department, which is a reference to HCD, has the authority to adopt guidelines to clarify what's going on in state ADU law. So previously, this was a section in Article 2. Now it's in Article 1. And again, that reinforces the idea that the guidelines authority applies to the whole of state ADU law. It's not just about ADUs specifically. It's also about JDUs, separate sale of ADUs. And so the change that the bill made was to replace the word article with chapter to just refer to that whole chapter 13 that we call state ADU law. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Article 2. Like I mentioned, this is the article of state ADU law that has guidelines or regulations that are specific to ADUs as opposed to JDUs. And so this is just a summary of what we're about to cover. Right? So changes from this 2025 legislation cover requirements for ADU ordinances, application review procedures, covers what happens if you're a local agency without an ADU ordinance, limits on development standards, 66223 units, review of ADU ordinances, certificates of occupancy, and ADUs in the coastal zone. Okay, so Government Code Section 66314. This is a really minor change. This is a code section that's about what has to be in an ADU ordinance. So it's just basically like a grammatical change to the word uninhabitable to make it uninhabitable. Not really a substantive change, but just a heads up that if you see some notes as you're reading the statute and you're wondering what changed, that's what changed in this section, okay? Next up, we have Government Code Section 66317. So this is the section that's really getting into the review procedures for ADU applications. And so one of the big changes here is it says that permitting agencies have 15 business days to determine whether an ADU application is complete. Otherwise, the application is deemed complete. So this is different from what the 2025 handbook said. We had an interpretation there that there was a 30 calendar day deadline under the Permit Streamlining Act to make that determination about whether the application is complete. So here the statute is clarifying, nope, it's 15 business days. If you're familiar with post-entitlement phase permit law, the provisions there are very similar to this. So it's 15 business days. Another change that happened in this section is the JADU specific content was removed and relocated to Article 3, which Mike is going to talk about in a few minutes. And then there's a local appeals process. So local agencies have to have an appeals process if the application is determined to be incomplete or if it's denied. And so the local agency gets to decide if that appeal is to the planning commission or the governing body or both. Governing body would be like the city council or the board of supervisors if it's a county. And then once they receive that appeal, there's a 60 business day deadline to provide a written determination about the appeal. Okay, so next up, we've got Government Code Section 66320. So this is like review procedures if you don't have an ADU ordinance. So what the change that was made here is really just to simplify it. Instead of kind of listing out a lot of what we just talked about in 66317, it just points back to 66317. And so it's simplified. It's clear that if you don't have an ADU ordinance, the review procedures you're supposed to follow for ADUs are the same as if you did have an ADU ordinance. Okay, next up, we've got Government Code Section 66321. So this is a section, so back in 66314, it talks about these are the things you have to have in an ADU ordinance. These are the kinds of development standards you can apply to ADUs that are not 66323 units, right? But what this section is doing is saying, okay, you can apply certain development standards, but they're also limited in certain ways, right? So what's happening here is that there's an existing provision that said if you set a maximum floor area on an ADU, that cannot be less than 850 square feet or 1,000 square feet if the ADU has more than one bedroom. So what this is doing is saying those measurements, what we're measuring is interior livable space. Again, it's a theme that runs through SB 543. We're clarifying, so the bill is clarifying that we're talking about interior livable space. And then there's another provision that talks about certain development standards that have to be waived if they would prevent an 800 square foot ADU from being built. Things like lot coverage, floor area ratio, open space. So again, the clarification is that the 800 square feet is of interior livable space. Okay, so now with regard to Government Code Section 66323, the big clarification here is that is just in the language about how these units can be combined with each other. So the language, instead of, you have the quote there at the bottom where it says any of the following or any combination of the following units. That's the big clarification. So what we're trying to convey here is, like, when you're reviewing ADU applications and there's a single family primary dwelling under 66323, you get a single family conversion ADU, a JADU, and a detached ADU up to 800 square feet under 66323, right? And then for a multifamily primary dwelling, you can combine multifamily conversion ADUs up to 25% of the number of existing units, plus multifamily detached ADUs, like Mike talked about. Another thing that's happening here is when this section is talking about the single family detached ADU, it says the local agency can limit it to 800 square feet. So again, it clarifies 800 square feet of interior livable space. The next thing is that there's some language in here about fire sprinkler requirements and how they're limited. And so that language is now applied explicitly to JADUs as well. So it's like an ADU or JADU can't be required to have fire sprinklers unless they were required for the primary dwelling, and the ADU or JADU doesn't trigger fire sprinkler requirements in the primary dwelling. The next change is there's a subdivision G that was deleted. So this is a change from AB 130. So subdivision G said that if you had adopted a certain kind of ADU ordinance by the middle of 2018, and that specifically an ordinance that allowed ADUs within multifamily dwellings, then you were allowed to apply more regulations to 323 units. But now that's deleted. And so any ordinances that are relying on that authority should keep in mind that that authority is no longer there, right? So what this does is it creates a more uniform regulatory environment across the state for 66323 units. Okay, so next up is Government Code Section 66326. This has to do with the review of ADU ordinances. And so let's get into the specifics of these new situations where an ADU ordinance can be null and void. So one thing that can make the ordinance null and void is if the local agency fails to submit it to HCD within 60 days after adoption. And by the way, when we're talking about days, it's calendar days unless the law specifically says business days. So here we're talking about calendar days, right? The next thing is the ordinance is null and void. So if we review your ordinance and we send you a letter saying, hey, we found some problems with your ordinance, we call these findings letters or ordinance review letters, you have to provide a formal response within 30 days or the ordinance is null and void. So that doesn't necessarily mean you have to adopt a new ordinance and fix every problem within 30 days. It means you have to write to us and say, hey, here's what we think about your findings letter. Specifically, here's our plan to come into compliance. That's what's due within 30 days, okay? So, and like with other situations where an ordinance is null and void, the local agency has to default to state ADU law until they have a compliant ordinance in effect. Okay, next up we have Government Code Section 66328. This is regarding certificates of occupancy. And so, like I mentioned before, there's a general rule in the law that a primary dwelling has to have a certificate of occupancy before the ADU, or it can be concurrently with the ADU. But basically, you don't have an ADU before a primary dwelling because an ADU is defined as a unit that exists in relation to a primary dwelling. So what this does is it, in light of some of the recent disasters that the state has experienced, there's now a disaster recovery exception to this rule. So so when we're in a situation where the governor has issued an emergency proclamation after February 1st of 2025, and the primary dwelling is substantially damaged or destroyed by that emergency, and the ADU is detached from that primary dwelling, and the ADU is permitted and passes all required inspections, then the ADU can be permitted before the primary dwelling. So that's the exception. And the purpose of this is to address disaster recovery situations and provide more flexibility. There are some situations where folks may not be fully insured against the cost of fully recovering after a disaster. And so sometimes an ADU is a way to get some more income coming in, get something built quickly, so that folks can recover more quickly and have a long-term viable financial path to fully recovering and rebuilding. So very important there. And again, if our plan on the questions is, if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A. We will be responding to questions there. So if you could do that, it would really help us out. Thank you so much. Okay, so next up, we've got Government Code Section 66329. So this is regarding ADUs in the coastal zone. So what's happening here is there is an existing provision of state ADU law where ADU laws basically providing some deference to the Coastal Act. The Coastal Act is a statute that dates back to 1976 that's intended to ensure that the coastal environment is protected, that folks have access to the coast, and there are a variety of related goals there. And so what happens is local governments, they develop what are called local coastal programs, which are basically all of the land use regulations that apply in the coastal zone and implement the Coastal Act at the local level. Right? So, and as part of this process, when we have projects that meet the definition of development in the Coastal Act, then they have to get a coastal development permit. And so there are different scenarios. If the local government has a local coastal program, they're going to be the permitting agency for the coastal development permit. If the local agency doesn't have a local coastal program, then the Coastal Commission is going to be the permitting agency for that coastal development permit. So what's happening here is it's bringing in the review, like some of the review procedures from Government Code Section 66317. So when a local agency has that certified local coastal program and they're issuing coastal development permits, even if we're in the coastal zone, they have 15 business days to determine whether an ADU application is complete, and they have 60 days, calendar days, to approve or deny when there's an existing primary dwelling on the property. And then in the other situation, where the Coastal Commission is the permitting agency for those coastal development permits, it's very similar. So the Coastal Commission has a 60-day deadline to approve or deny the ADU application when there's an existing primary dwelling. And then here, there's an aspect of concurrent review. So the Coastal Commission is considering the coastal development permit application. The local agency is considering other aspects of the application, like whether the application complies with the building standards code. And those reviews are supposed to happen concurrently. The other big change here is there's a section of the Coastal Act, that's the Public Resources Code 3603, that provides an appeals process for certain developments that require coastal development permits to the Coastal Commission. Right? So like the local agency makes a decision, and then it can be appealed to the Coastal Commission when certain conditions are met. So what this is saying is that when the coastal development permit is for an ADU, that's not appealable to the Coastal Commission. But just to clarify with something we said before, there is still a local appeals process for determinations of incompleteness and denials of ADU applications. Okay, and with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mike to talk about Article 3.
Thank you very much, David. All right, so new stuff for JADUs. Slide, please. All right, so 66333B, owner occupancy for new JADUs may now only be required when sanitation facilities are shared with the primary dwelling. This is new. This is a big change. And Section G, correction oversight. State AD law always said that rental terms for ADUs must be longer than 30 days. That did not appear in J80 law until this recent change. So there you go. David, next slide, please. Okay, 66333.5 gives HCD overt enforcement authority over JAU ordinances with submission parameters purview identical to that of ADU ordinances. It accounts for non-compliance, violation, notification, all that stuff. Everything that was built into ADU review authority has now been overtly stated with JADU authority, just to make it extra clear. Slide, please. Section 66335. So this is the completeness thing that David mentioned earlier. A2A, local jurisdictions are required to determine completeness of a JADU application within 15 days. There are procedures to amend incompleteness. And Section D, Subdivision D, no competing ordinance can delay or deny a JADU permit that conforms to the section. Slide, please. 66339.5 permits local jurisdictions to be more generous or permissive with JADU regulations, with the caveat. The permissiveness must consider that the definition of a JADU is very strictly regulated. Any unit that is created that does not conform to the definition of a JADU cannot be considered one. So we can't have new construction detached JADUs. We can't have new construction attached JADUs with an existing single-family primary dwelling. We can't have JADUs in a multifamily primary dwelling. State JADU law is very clear on what a JADU is. So provided that you can meet that definition, a local jurisdiction can choose to be more flexible. Slide, please. Okay. All right. Now, I'd like to introduce the HCD's role and next steps. David, next slide, please. So we review local ordinances for consistency with state ADU law, and we generally write findings letters, findings of inconsistency to local jurisdictions with ordinances that don't quite link up to state ADU law. These seem scary at first to some places, but it's supposed to be the beginning of the conversation. This is supposed to be collaborative. It's not combative. We want to help local jurisdictions come into consistency with state ADU law. Provided that the relationship continues to be collaborative, things tend to get worked out pretty well. But there have been situations where escalation does occur. We can go from a findings letter to a letter of technical assistance to a notice of potential violation to a notice of violation, all the way up to referral to the Office of the Attorney General. Very rare, very, very rare. Slide, please. To the public, we provide technical assistance to the public and to local jurisdictions via our online ADU portal. If you have any questions, you have any complaints, you have any ordinance submissions, please put it through the portal. We will make sure that we provide a link to that. Creating an account takes very little time, and you need that account so that you can track all responses. The inquiries stay in our system, and they're trackable, and that we can move between people working on any one case. I can tell David Barbosa about, here's the situation I'm having with this particular inquiry. Can you help me out? And anytime that you submit something to HCD, please provide documentation. If you experience a denial and you think that there's a problem, please provide documentation of the denial, and so on. Slide, please. Okay, there is the link to our technical assistance portal. Is that clickable? Or simply search HCD ADU on your preferred internet browser. We will show up. On our landing page, you'll see contact us at the very bottom of the screen. That's where you get to the portal. Yeah, next slide, please. Any questions? I mean, we've gotten 143 plus 92, so we're keeping up best as we possibly can. Yeah, if you haven't yet, please look at the answered column in the Q&A. We tried to get to everybody. There's a lot. And if at the end of the conversation here you still have questions, we direct you to the ADU portal, please.
So Yeah, and so what we have planned here is we're going to be looking for questions in that Q&A box, and we're going to take the opportunity here to select some questions and answer them live. We can go until 2:30, and then unfortunately we won't be able to get to all of them, but like Mike said, we've got the portal available for follow up. And so let's take a look. I just need a minute here to review, and we'll kind of take turns answering some questions.
One of the things that I saw a couple of times were questions about SB 9. An older version of our handbook, which needs to be corrected, said that under no circumstances is a lot that uses SB 9 expected to have more than 4 units. That is incorrect for duplexes. Split lots under section 66411.7 are overtly capped at 2 units of any format. You get 1 primary dwelling unit and an ADU or JADU, or you get 2 primary dwelling units. You may not have anything more than that on a split lot. On an unsplit lot that is subject to it, or that has a 2-unit project, a duplex, it is considered a primary dwelling. Either if the primary dwelling units in question are attached to one another, then it's considered a multifamily primary dwelling and subject to the allowances due to a multifamily primary dwelling for the whole of state ADU law. If they are detached from one another, you get 2 detached primary dwelling units, then the lot is considered a single family primary dwelling unit, and the allowances are then tailored to the primary dwelling unit being single family. So you can have the 1 JAU, 1 interior ADU, and 1 new construction detached unit up to 800 square feet, as well as 1 unit per 66314 of any format.
All right. And I'm seeing a question here from Mireya, who writes, I'm new here and desire to build an ADU for an aging parent. It would be converting my garage, not freestanding. Will this webinar give more details? So this webinar is really focused specifically on the changes that came from legislation that was signed in 2025 and kind of how that impacts our handbook addendum. We've given other presentations that are like a more general overview of state ADU law. But just quickly, like the kind of project that you're describing should be permissible. It sounds like you're talking about a garage conversion. And so it's a good idea to check in with the local agency about their application checklist and development standards. But this kind of application is probably going to come under Government Code Section 66323. So it's going to be subject to a pretty limited set of development standards.
A few questions in here about side and rear setbacks. For new construction structures, no more than 4 feet. For existing structures, setbacks may not preclude that unit. So wherever it is on the lot, if it's an existing structure, it can be converted in place. All right, so I'm seeing from Andy Kang, for side setbacks, does it matter if it is a corner lot? Corner lots and through lots, these are terms of art that do not appear in state ADU law. State ADU law recognizes only 1 front setback and side and rear setbacks otherwise. Now there may be standards involving safety, like visibility safety, if they're based on objective ministerial standards that can affect layouts and where a unit can be situated. But basically, a corner lot doesn't get 2 front setbacks.
Okay, and I'm seeing a question here from Jared Chavez. So Jared writes, does that mean that we can no longer require owner occupancy? So the change that was made here recently is to the owner occupancy requirement in JADU law. So it's basically saying so previously like owner occupancy was required in a JDU unless the JDU is owned by a government agency, land trust, or housing organization. So now we still have the exceptions for government agency, land trust, or housing organization, but it's narrow. It's a more narrow owner occupancy requirement because it applies if the JDU is like sharing a bathroom with the main house, but not otherwise. So that's how the JDU owner occupancy was narrowed. And then regular ADUs don't have an owner occupancy requirement at all. That was existing now.
It's just tough because there's a lot of questions. We will be distributing this meeting as a recording within 2 weeks or so. A lot of people are asking if this is going to be available after the fact.
Yeah, thank you for submitting all the questions to the Q&A box. We're just kind of, we're doing this live, and so we're kind of waiting for your questions and figuring out which ones would be the most relevant to answer here. So just bear with us for a minute.
Hey, David, we're losing the ends of your sentences, so make sure that you're speaking up nice and loud.
Thank you.
Question from Larissa Loma. Does HCD agree that the attached detached ADUs allowed up to 850/1000 square feet under 66321B2 must still comply with all other local development standards, including lot coverage, floor area ratio, front setback? Yes. I think that there was, we're talking about 6632321B3 requires that a unit up to 800 square feet may not be precluded by those items. But if an application comes in for 1,000 square foot unit, and the lot has exceeded its floor area ratio, or the 1,000 square foot unit would exceed the floor area ratio, a local jurisdiction may say, no, this exceeds our floor area ratio, for example.
Okay, and I'm seeing a question here from Jennifer, who writes, are there any requirements on a parking space for for an ADU? So this is an area where the 2025 legislation didn't really change things a lot. So there's some good information in the older part of our handbook about that. But basically, if we're talking about a 66323 unit, you don't have parking requirements for those units. For other ADUs, the local agency can require one space per unit or per bedroom, whichever is less, with some exceptions. So, for example, like if you're within half a mile of a transit stop, there's no parking required. So it's good to you have to first kind of classify your ADU, like which section of the law are you applying under, and then we can answer more detailed questions about parking requirements through our TA portal.
We got a question about tiny homes on wheels. Is a tiny home on wheels considered an ADU, or can it be considered an ADU? Tiny homes on wheels is a term of art that does not appear in state ADU law. An ADU needs to have a permanent foundation. It needs to have complete independent living facilities. ADU has to match the definition of an ADU. And generally, tiny homes on wheels do not meet the definition of an ADU.
Okay, seeing a question here from David Lopez, who writes, we have an architect that says ADUs do not have to meet fire separation requirements because of SB 1211. So here, ADUs are required to comply with the California Building Standards Code, including any valid local amendments to that code. And for manufactured homes, they have to comply with federal building standards. But typically, we're talking about the California Building Standards Code. So while there are some provisions in state ADU law and existing law that talk about the, for example, a single family conversion ADU has to have setbacks sufficient for fire and safety. So there are fire separation requirements in the Building Standards Code. They may or may not apply depending on factors like how an exterior wall is designed. But it's generally speaking, the rule is that ADUs have to comply with the building standards.
It's coming in from Andrew Wright. If we are doing two ADUs that are less than 400 square feet each on the property, and they still charge for school taxes. Each ADU needs to be considered on its own merit. It needs to be considered as its own application. There are places that say, like, collectively, if you create more than 800 square feet or 750 square feet of ADU at the same time, then you're subject to fees and whatnot. That is inconsistent with state ADU law. Now, no, HCD does not have enforcement authority over special districts like school districts. So if you encounter issues like that, you may want to consider the local appeals process.
Okay, and I'm seeing a question here from Marnie, who writes, under what circumstances can an ADU be deed restricted as an affordable unit? So there is an existing law. You have Government Code Section 66341, which talks about a scenario where a qualified nonprofit corporation develops an ADU that will be sold to a qualified buyer, which is defined as a low or moderate income household. So that's really the circumstance in which ADU law is contemplating a deed restricted affordable ADU. Yeah, if you have any follow-up questions, you can send them to our portal.
Seen the question more than once regarding agriculturally zoned areas. Can ADUs be permitted, or local jurisdictions required to permit approve ADUs in agricultural zones? State ADU law just says residential zones. Anything outside of a residential zoned area is subject to local discretion. So if it's ag, it's commercial, the local jurisdiction can choose whether or not to approve such a unit.
Got a question here from Meredith. He's asking, can a municipality opt to allow the sale of JADUs or allow the JADU to be attached to a detached JADU or SB9 unit? So here, one of the provisions in JADU law is that there has to be a deed restriction on a JADU, and one of the things that has to be in that deed restriction is that it cannot be sold separately from the primary dwelling. And then with regard to, and the other thing is, like, a JADU is defined so that it has to be within a single family dwelling. So it's not the kind of unit that can be attached to a detached ADU. As Mike mentioned, there is a new provision in the law that allows for less restrictive development standards, but those are only going to apply to things that are not, like, in the definition of an ADU, of a JADU.
We have a question here. Can JADUs be utilized as deed restricted units for the purpose of qualifying for builder's remedy? Deed restricted in the sense that like income wise deed restricted, very low income, extremely low income, no. Deed restricted, you can't have affordability requirements built into a JADU deed restriction. As I mentioned earlier, only two items can appear on a deed restriction for a JADU. It can be, a local jurisdiction can consider an ADU or a JADU low income, provided it meets the, oh gosh, sorry, things are having a problem on my end. There we go.
And then just, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just had another thought on that as well. The other thing is, like, you know, with regard to the builder's remedy, that's a reference to the Housing and Accountability Act. So we have another team, like another part of our team here at HCD that covers the Housing Accountability Act. So if you have an ADU question that intersects with another state housing law, like density bonus law, or the Housing Accountability Act, or the Housing Crisis Act, or there's a long list of laws we have enforcement authority over. We sometimes will get inquiries like that, and we'll collaborate across our teams to come up with some kind of a response. So we can look into that in more detail if you submit it.
We got a question from Benjamin Patterson. Does a coastal city have discretion to deny an ADU if it requires a CDP? What to supersede or in any way alter or lessen the effect of the application of the California Coastal Act of 1976? David, this is your wheelhouse.
Oh, sorry, Mike. I was reading another question while you were.
We got a question about the coastal zone.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Could you repeat it?
Right. What does supersede or in any way alter or lessen the effect or application of the California Coastal Act of 1976 mean?
Yeah. Okay. So the concept of coastal preemption of state ADU laws are really interesting area. We do get a lot of cases about it. And so the idea is that state ADU law applies in the coastal zone, but it doesn't supersede the Coastal Act, including provisions in the Certified Local Coastal Program, except as specifically provided in state ADU law. So, so the exceptions that are specifically provided in state ADU law are things like the review deadlines that we talked about earlier. For these kinds of questions, definitely recommend submitting to the portal so we can take a look at the specific issues that are coming up in a particular case. We have had some interesting cases that deal with older LCPs that haven't been updated yet to conform to the current version of state ADU law. And so, unfortunately, there's not always a simple answer to that question, but it's definitely the kind of thing that we can take a closer look at.
Okay, I'd like to complete my thought from earlier about deed restrictions and income for JADUs. Sorry, my screen went black right as I was in the middle of that. Deed restrictions proposed by the applicants can be used to meet builder's remedy requirements, but the local agency can't impose the deed restriction. That is all.
Okay, I see a question here from Sharon. How is ADU area calculated? Is it gross area, including mechanical space, walls, etc.? And how are stairs counted? 1 times in the footprint or 2 times? So here, this is a really, I think this is really closely related to a change that was made by SB 543, because as we covered at several points earlier, there are several provisions of state ADU law that are specifically referencing like a maximum floor area or a limit on a local maximum floor area. And so it's really done with regard to interior livable space. And so what's important there is to look at the definition of livable space. So it calls out spaces for living, sleeping, eating, cooking, and sanitation. I think it's helpful sometimes also to look at that in the context of the definition of habitable space in the Building Standards Code, which is not the same, but it's similar. And so for things like stairs, those are kind of like utility accessory spaces. They're not like the core living, sleeping, eating, cooking, sanitation spaces that we're talking about in the definition of livable space.
Got a few folks who are still a little lost in unit allowances. It's worth going over this again. The units that are created subject to section 66323, that section begins with the phrase notwithstanding sections 66314 through 66322 inclusive. So basically, regardless of what happened earlier, a local agency must ministerially permit the following, any combination of the following. Section 66314 creates a whole other category of local development standards subject units, which per 317 are required to be ministerially considered. So local jurisdictions can choose to cap the number of units that may be created on a lot, but that must account for at least one unit created subject to section 66314. Units subject to that section may be of any format, and generally they can be a little bit larger than units created subject to the other section, and they must be ministerially combined with any and all combination that's required by 66323. So with a lot with a single family primary dwelling unit, you may have in any combination one unit of any format per 314, so that's new construction attached, detached, or interior. You may have one interior unit created subject to section 66323A1. You may have one in JADU, which has to be created in existing space or in the proposed space of a proposed single family dwelling. And you may have one new construction detached unit up to 800 square feet per 323A2. So it's four ADUs in addition to the primary dwelling unit. Generally speaking, what that means is that if you have a converted unit already, you may convert another one per the opposite section of state AD law. If you already have a unit created subject, if you already have a detached unit somewhere on the lot and you created it per 323, you can create another one per 314. That will be subject to local development standards. It may be a little bit larger, but you can have two detached under those conditions. You can have two converted under those conditions. Just gives places a little bit more flexibility. It's all governed by the practical limitations of any particular lot. Not every lot is going to be able to have enough space to provide for all the units that are possible under state ADU law. But state ADU law requires at least those minimums to be available to any lot. And then with multifamily primary dwellings, section 314 still applies. There was some confusion a few years ago where some authorities thought that primary dwelling only referred to single family, but primary dwelling in 314 refers to both single family primaries and multifamily primaries. So at least one unit subject to that section must be allowed with a multifamily primary dwelling. That must be combined ministerially with all the units provided for with 323. With an existing multifamily complex or duplex is such as it may be, you can have up to 25% of the number of units that exist already on that lot created within converted non-habitable space. So if you've got 8 units on a lot and you've got a welcome center or some other a structure that's not being used, you can convert that to 2 units per 323A3. On that same lot with 8 existing units, you can create, if the lot permits it, up to 8 new construction detached units. Those 2 formats need to be allowed in combination with one another, and it needs to be allowed in combination with at least 1 unit per 314. With a proposed multifamily dwelling, you may have 1 unit per 314 of any format and up to 2 new construction detached per 323A4. Now, there's a lot of numbers and letters, I'm sorry. But the short answer is proposed multifamily, fewer options, but existing multifamily, a lot more options.
Got a question here from Kyle, who writes, under section 66323, JADUs are listed. Section 66323E states that local agencies can establish term limited, i.e. 30 days for ADUs under this section. Therefore, we should be able to include term limits for JADUs qualifying under section 66323. So this speaks to one of the changes that was made by recent legislation. So previously it was, this is interesting because 66323 is part of Article 2, which is mostly about ADUs, but it also talks about JDUs, right? But what happened is now we have a new code section in Article 3 that explicitly addresses the issue of short-term rental of JADUs and prohibits it. So that's now so that's an issue where previously the law was explicit with regard to ADUs, and it was at most implicit or silent with regard to JDUs. Now it's explicit with regard to short-term rental of JDUs. So take a look at Article 3 and you'll see that prohibition on short-term rentals.
All right, so we've got a question that involves SB9, but it also kind of touches on non-conforming zoning conditions. So with we get the question on an SB9 lot not split with 2 units, each one is considered a primary and can have the full array of ADUs by right? No. State ADU law talks about allowances in terms of per lot. 323, A1, A2, all that talk about how many ADUs you can have per lot, not per primary dwelling structure. So if you've got two detached SB9 units, or if you have an existing non-conforming zoning condition where there are 2 existing single-family detached dwellings, you may have the full allowance of units per a single-family primary dwelling, but only 1 per lot. So you can't have 2 JADUs, you can't have 2 new construction detached per A2, you get 1 per. So you can have 1 JADU in one building, you can have 1 converted unit in the other building, but at the full yield will remain the same. So you can't hack it, so to speak, and get multiple allowances for however many primary dwellings you have on that lot.
Got a question here from Mikey, who writes, if there is a height restriction on an attached ADU and the duplex is located on a steep hillside, is the height determined from the uphill side, which is 18 feet, and from the downhill side, which is 32 feet in height? So I think this is actually related to a case that is assigned to me. So I think I'll reserve the full answer for, I can follow up with you under the case. But basically, this is, so state ADU law limits local regulation, like local height, it limits local height limits. It says the local height limits can exceed certain levels, including for an attached ADU. What state ADU law doesn't do is define building height. So what we do is we look at, there's a definition in the Building Standards Code, and I can follow up with you more under the case. Thank you for the question.
Two 247 open questions, 131 answered questions, plus a few that we just didn't click anything on.
Thank you all so much for the questions. Sorry we can't get to all of them, but we'll do our best.
Thank you to whoever just gave us that little applause icon. Feels good. Oh, we're getting more. This is nice. Hey, I wasn't to request for feedback, but it is appreciated. Thank you very much.
I've got one, like, so Adrienne writes, can you clarify the statement that ADUs can be built in the front setback? Okay, so this is the analysis here. It's really important to classify the ADU that we're talking about. Are we talking about a 66323 unit or not, right? So if we're talking about a detached 66323 unit, the rule is you cannot apply a front setback to that unit because subdivision B of 66323 says local agencies have to limit themselves to the development standards that are in 66323 for those units, right? And front setbacks are not one of the development standards in 323. If we're talking about another kind of ADU, like under Government Code Section 66314, like for example, an attached new construction ADU, then a front setback requirement could be applicable. That is an objective standard, but in 66321B3, it says there's certain development standards that have to be waived if they would not permit an 800 square foot ADU. So we have to look at the size of the ADU and which code section the applicant is applying under to answer that question.
I got one from Begeshri. If applicable, fire regulations preclude development of an ADU on a property. The state ADU law preempt those regulations and still require allowance of an 800 square foot ADU. No, fire codes, fire regulations, that takes precedence. There have been, we did go back and forth with CAL FIRE over the very high fire hazard severity zone for a good while, because local jurisdictions were using that to say you can't have an ADU in the very high fire hazard severity zone. CAL FIRE assured us we don't want to limit construction, and indeed, construction helps with fire mitigation. And in fact, with the recent fires over here I'm in Los Angeles County, I'm right next to Altadena. And we saw with some of the new construction at the south end of the burn zone, those ended up being fire breaks because they're built to the latest specifications, the state-of-the-art fire codes. And the new construction ended up saving structures to the south by being that fire break. So they want the development. But at the end of the day, HCD does not have enforcement authority over fire authorities. And we defer to what a local agency would say in terms of fire safety.
All right, got a question here. If a builder developed a housing project that featured a primary home plus 3 ADUs on each lot, does CEQA apply? So state ADU law says ADU applications have to be reviewed ministerially, but it doesn't limit the local agency's review process on a primary dwelling. So like the primary dwelling might be subject to CEQA depending on whether the local agency has a discretionary review process for that dwelling. And so what state ADU law says is when a primary dwelling is proposed, the ADU has to be reviewed through, like if there's a discretionary process on the primary dwelling, ADU has to be reviewed through a separate ministerial process.
All right, so we got a few questions about unpermitted ADUs. That was referenced earlier in terms of like a change to the code numbering. It is no longer section 66332. It is now, perfect timing for that, in a different part of, where is it? Section 66311.7. So it's at the beginning of state ADU law. Units that are unpermitted units that were created before January 1st, 2020 need to be provided a pathway to compliance by the local jurisdiction, a penalty-free pathway to compliance from the local jurisdiction. Now, a local jurisdiction can deny an application for the legitimizing of an unpermitted unit if it's found to be substandard. When like these units need to be habitable, but if it's shown to be habitable, then it needs to be approved. And any unit created subject to section 66332, section 66311.7, gotta renumber all this stuff in my head. Those units don't count towards the other categories of new ADUs, like the allowances that are required by other parts of state ADU law. Because the number of unpermitted units that were created before January 1st, 2020 is a finite number. There are only so many places that will count. My supervisor is asking me to stop talking there. I will. This is a bit of a frontier for us.
We're coming close to the end of our time here, so I think we have time for maybe one more question. Um, so Amber asks, is there a definition of interior livable space? So this is an interesting point because the term livable space is defined in Article 1, but the term interior livable space is not. So like you'll see at different points throughout the statute, sometimes it says interior livable space, sometimes it says livable space. Basically, we're talking about livable space within a structure either way. So I hope that's not too much of a problem for folks as they're interpreting it. But that is a good point. Technically, it's like the term that's defined is livable space.
It is 2:30. I think we should probably wrap it there. Ladies and
Yeah,
gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm happy we got to 140 of your questions. For the 273 people who did not have their questions answered, we encourage you to go over to the portal, submit your questions. We are here at your disposal. We want to provide the public a really clear understanding of all of these allowances. They change almost every year. There's been a big change to state AD law, and everybody's playing catch up. But the team is standing by and available to help.
yeah. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate your attendance and all the great questions. We are here to help. So I know it can sometimes feel overwhelming to keep up with all the changes in state ADU law, but I think as we saw before, ADUs are the permitting numbers are up. It's been a really promising way for California to address its housing challenges. And so we look forward to continuing to work with you to get even more ADUs built and answer your questions. So thank you very much, everyone.
Great day. Cheers.
Mhm.